This case takes place in the USA in the year 2014. On the 5th of June 2014, a highway maintenance worker was mowing grass in the town of Geneva, Wisconsin, when all of a sudden he noticed two suitcases abandoned in tall weeds along North Como Road. He moved the luggage aside and continued on with his work. Initially, he was totally unaware of what he had just come across. After all, he found this kind of thing all the time. But just later that day, a passing motorist spotted the suitcases still lying near the roadside. But only now, they were swarming with flies. The motorist grew suspicious, so he immediately called the police. He urged that an officer come down and just check them out. And so, officers set off from the station and pulled up to the roadside. They opened up the suitcases, and inside they discovered the curled up remains of not one, but two female bodies. One body appeared to be considerably more decomposed than the other. The police immediately secured the scene and began treating the area as a homicide crime scene. Both of the bodies were then transported for autopsies and forensic examination. Examiners noticed a stark difference in the condition of the two remains. One of the victims' bodies was severely decomposed, suggesting her death had occurred many months earlier than the others. This victim's corpse was found partially wrapped in black plastic garbage bags, and her wrists had been tightly bound behind her back with rope. The second body was relatively intact, and instead of being wrapped, she was found nude, with rope still looped around her neck and a red ball gag strapped in her mouth by a collar. These distinctive details, such as the bindings, gag, and ligatures, indicated that both women had likely died by asphyxiation. With little to go on at the dump site itself, detectives turned to missing persons records and forensic clues to try and identify the victims. Based on preliminary observations, they believed that one of the victims was a middle-aged woman, while the other one was much younger. She may have been a teen or a woman in her early 20s. Investigators quickly got a critical lead on the older victim. Within days, they matched her fingerprints and her description to a recent missing persons report from Minnesota. She was identified as 37-year-old Laura Simonson. Laura was from Farmington, Minnesota, and she was last seen alive in the city of Rochester on the 2nd of November 2013. Her mother then reported her missing on the 22nd of November that year. With Laura identified, the investigation turned into an interstate collaboration. Laura had last been seen at a hotel, the Microtel Inn. So, on the 12th of June, police visited the motel and learned that on the 2nd of November 2013, Laura checked in alongside with a 52-year-old man. The hotel handed over their guest book, and there they found the man she checked in with. His name was Stephen Zelich. And Stephen checked out alone the very next morning. This was a pivotal discovery. Armed with this information, investigators in Minnesota obtained a warrant and scoured the hotel room where Stephen and Laura had stayed. Meanwhile, other members of the task force delved into the background of Stephen. They discovered that he was a resident of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. More specifically, he lived in a suburb called West Allis. He worked as a licensed security officer, but before that, Stephen was a former law enforcement officer. With mounting suspicion, Wisconsin detectives began surveillance on Stephen while forensic tests were rushed through the waiting list. By the 24th of June 2014, authorities announced that they had uncovered physical evidence linking Stephen to both of the suitcase victims. Officials did not publicly disclose the nature of this evidence, but it was strong enough to establish a probable cause. At this point, Stephen was officially deemed the prime suspect in the case. On the 25th of June, officers moved in to arrest Stephen. The 52-year-old man was taken into custody at his workplace. The arrest was made without incident. Stephen was then questioned by the police, and his background was scrutinized even further. It turned out that he joined the police in 1989 and served as a police officer in the Milwaukee area, doing so for around 12 years. But his law enforcement career ended abruptly in 2001 after an investigation into a disturbing off-duty incident. In May of 2001, a sex worker whom Stephen had met at a bar fled from Stephen's apartment half naked in fear for her life. The woman later told investigators that Stephen had restrained her and that she bolted out of the apartment when she heard him take out a pair of handcuffs. Now, Stephen denied attacking the woman. He claimed that she had tried to steal from him and that no violence occurred. However, he did admit to using a sex worker, which was a violation of department policy and law. Facing likely dismissal or criminal charges, Stephen instead decided to resign from the police force in August of 2001. After leaving the police, Stephen kept a low profile and transitioned to working as a security guard. He lived alone, and to casual acquaintances and neighbors, nothing seemed obviously amiss in his life, as is usually the case. But privately, Stephen nurtured an intense interest in domination, bondage, and sadomasochism. By 2007, he was active on multiple websites for these kinds of things, and his username was Mr. Handcuffs. He presented himself as an experienced dominant male looking for a long-term submissive partner. In one profile, he wrote that he was seeking a long-term 24/7 slave for absolute ownership and slavery. He wanted this slave to be tied up, gagged, blindfolded, hooded, chained, caged, and led by a collar and a leash. These activities were hidden from Stephen's family and his co-workers. They knew nothing of his online alias, Mr. Handcuffs. On the very morning of his arrest in June of 2014, Stephen was still visiting these websites on his mobile phone, suggesting that he was actively seeking new encounters up until the moment he was captured. Following Stephen's arrest, the case against him developed rapidly. He waived his right to remain silent and cooperated with investigators, providing a grim account of what happened to the two women in the suitcases. Stephen admitted that he was directly responsible for the deaths of both women, Laura Simonson and the still unidentified younger victim, although he claims that neither was intentional. In Stephen's versions of events, both women died accidentally during consensual encounters that involved bondage and breath play. He told detectives that he met both women through online forums and arranged private meetings with them in person. During these meetings, Stephen restrained and choked them as part of a pre-agreed scenario. But in each case, he said he lost control and went too far, causing the women to suffocate. Stephen provided chilling details for the investigators. He described how both women lost consciousness during a choking session, and then he realized they were dead and panicked. He did nothing to try and revive the women. Instead, Stephen admitted that he moved swiftly to hide the evidence of his actions. In August of 2012, after the death of the first victim, he placed her body into a suitcase and transported it back to his apartment. He stored her body in a large refrigerator in his home to slow the decomposition. Over a year later, in November of 2013, Stephen met Laura in Minnesota. When Laura died in a hotel room under similar circumstances, Stephen sealed her body inside a separate suitcase. Because it was cold outside and because he was traveling by car, he kept Laura's suitcase in the trunk of his vehicle for some time. By early 2014, Stephen now had two deceased victims hidden, one in his personal refrigerator and one in the trunk of his car. Before too long, Stephen began to face mounting pressure and practical difficulties. He worried about being discovered, so Stephen decided to dispose of both bodies at once. He loaded the suitcases into his car and drove both of them out to a remote rural area that he was familiar with in Wisconsin, dumping them in the tall grass. Stephen admitted all of this in his statements to the police, framing the women's deaths as tragic accidents that he attempted to cover up. Based on Stephen's confessions, prosecutors moved quickly to formalize charges. A judge set his bail at $1 million. During this same time, the authorities still needed to identify their second victim. Although Stephen had confessed to killing the woman, he did not know her name, or so he claimed. The victim's fingerprints and DNA were not in any database, and crucially, there seemed to be no missing person report filed for her. In mid-June of 2014, they released a composite sketch of the woman's face, alongside with a description of her approximate age, height, and other distinguishing features. It was the first real glimpse of her face. The drawing showed a young woman with sharp cheekbones and a slight frame, along with teeth that were quite pronounced. They hoped that someone, somewhere, would recognize her. The sketch was circulated nationwide. It traveled far beyond Wisconsin. And nearly 2,000 miles away, in Oregon, it reached people who hadn't seen a familiar face in years. A number of people saw this sketch and thought that it looked strikingly similar to someone who had vanished in 2012. These people contacted the authorities in both Oregon and Wisconsin and told the police about their suspicions. They believed that this person was Jenny Gomez. Jenny was 19 when she left Oregon in 2012. She told friends and members of her foster family that she was moving away, possibly to California, maybe the Midwest. But shortly after she moved away, all contact faded. Jenny was described as quiet, artistic, and someone who had moved around within the foster system before aging out. There was no major missing person investigation when communication stopped. Acting on the tip, Jenny's dental records were cross-examined with the corpse. On the 30th of June 2014, at a press conference, officials confirmed that the second Suitcase victim had been positively identified as Jenny. She was no longer an anonymous sketch. She finally had a name. By early July of 2014, the case had largely come together. Both victims were identified, and Stephen had confessed to causing their deaths. But because the murders had taken place in two different states, it meant two jurisdictions, so two prosecutors, two homicide investigations running at the same time. By August of 2014, a decision was made that Wisconsin would move first. Stephen entered a plea of not guilty at his early court appearances, and by late 2015, the case was moving towards a jury trial. But then in January of 2016, just as jury selection was set to begin, Stephen abruptly changed his plea. For the death of Jenny, he pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of first-degree reckless homicide with use of a dangerous weapon and to hiding a corpse. This plea meant that Stephen admitted to causing Jenny's death while avoiding the harsher charge of intentional murder. At Stephen's sentencing in Wisconsin, held in March of 2016, the courtroom heard the grim details of Jenny's final moments. Well, according to Steve's own statements, the court heard that he had picked up Jenny at the Milwaukee airport and taken her to a hotel in Kenosha County back in late of 2012. There, they spent several days together. On the last day of that encounter, Stephen bound and choked Jenny as part of a self-described intercourse game. He claimed that he accidentally choked her to death when he lost control and failed to stop in time. As a result, Stephen was sentenced to 35 years in prison for the killing of Jenny and for concealing her corpse. The judge noted that Stephen's actions after the death, like refrigerating her body and then dumping her, showed a complete lack of respect for the victim's life. And then, in February of 2017, Stephen appeared in a Rochester, Minnesota courtroom, and, as he had done in Wisconsin, he chose to plead guilty rather than proceed to a trial. He pleaded guilty to a second-degree murder, so intentional but not premeditated. During the plea hearing, Stephen answered a series of questions from his defense attorney, admitting publicly for the first time what he had done to Laura. He acknowledged that he had met Laura through an online site and arranged to meet her in person. And then, on the 2nd and 3rd of November 2013, he bound, gagged, and strangled her. When asked in court if Laura had died because he didn't let her breathe, Stephen replied, correct. The Minnesota judge accepted Stephen's plea and proceeded to sentence. Stephen was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the second-degree murder. The judge fought back tears as she delivered her remarks. She told Stephen that human life is not something to be played with, and that Laura was loved and valued by those who called her mum, sister, daughter, and friend. Thankfully, the 25-year Minnesota sentence was ordered to run consecutively. In practical terms, this meant that Stephen faced a total of 60 years of imprisonment for the two homicide convictions. At 55 years old in 2017, Stephen would have to be around 115 years old by the time he serves the 60-year sentence, so basically, he was given life. Then, he had to be sentenced for hiding the corpse, which added another 10 years onto his sentence, so in the end, he was fully sentenced to 70 years in custody. Throughout the entire legal proceedings, Stephen did not waver from his basic story that the deaths were accidental, But no full trial ever occurred, where evidence and witnesses were presented to challenge these claims, because his guilty pleas precluded that. Stephen offered only a minimal apology through his attorneys. He often spoke in a flat, soft-spoken manner when answering the judge's questions, and he did not make any extensive statements of remorse to the victims' families as they looked on. Family members of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court during sentencing. In Minnesota, several of Laura's relatives spoke through tears about the pain Stephen had caused. Laura's sister described the heartbreak of knowing her mother would never see her daughter again, and she expressed anger that such a gentle, trusting woman had been taken in such a cruel way. She also mentioned that Laura had struggled with mental health issues and was a vulnerable woman. Laura's family also voiced dissatisfaction with the 25-year sentence, believing that this was inadequate. In Wisconsin, Jenny's family did not attend the court as they were thousands of miles away in Oregon. Her foster mother did send a statement describing Jenny as a bright young woman whose future was cut too short. It is tragic to think that none of her family bothered to attend. Stephen began serving his time in the Wisconsin prison system, classified as a high-risk inmate due to the notoriety of his case and perhaps for his own protection as a former police officer. In the years following his conviction, Stephen made at least one attempt to withdraw his guilt plea in the Wisconsin case. In 2020, he filed a post-conviction motion claiming that his defense attorney had been ineffective and Stephen was entitled to have a hearing on this matter. However, as of the latest updates, no court has vacated any of Stephen's convictions. Online records show no successful appeals in Minnesota, and Wisconsin court filings indicate that Stephen remains fully convicted on all counts. In all likelihood, the motions and appeals will not shorten Stephen's sentence. Jenny's remains were returned to Oregon, where her family quietly laid her to rest. Those who knew Jenny remembered her as a free spirit with a bubbly personality who had endured a difficult childhood. A former high school counselor said that she yearned for stability and love, neither of which she seemed to receive. Laura's family in Minnesota have struggled to move forward. Laura was the mother of 7 children. Due to personal difficulties, she had lost custody of them before her death. Many said that she had a kind heart despite the challenges in her life. Today, Stephen remains incarcerated in Wisconsin prison and will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars.